welcome to Sport of the Nation. I'm your host, Mike Sham, and with me today I have the one and only John Robbie. John, welcome to Sport of the Nation. It's so good to have you sitting in the seat.
Thanks very much indeed. Lovely to be here. I'm just worried what you say, the one and only. What is that? Is
Yeah,
that good or bad?
It's very good. Well, only because I've never heard of any other John Robbies other than you. So
all right.
you
Okay.
in
The
my
one
mind,
and
you're the
only.
one and only. But it's
Good save. Good save.
Good to have you here. And we thought we'd have a little chat. Now, John, I first became aware of you, like most South Africans, in 1980. An unbelievable series against the Lions. The Lions, you know, it's easy to forget that it was not that long after the debacle of 1974 when the Springboks were absolutely crushed by Willie John McBride's team. And South Africa was in the depths of isolation. And the next thing, the British Lions were going to tour South Africa.
British and Irish Lions.
And Irish Lions. My South Africanness is showing.
Excuse me.
And the technicality that people sort of forget that made that possible at the time was that it wasn't a national team as such. Right? Am I correct?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, it was always a sort of a grey area. I mean, the next year Ireland came,
yes,
and everybody was against it, and yet the sporting bodies said, you know, the sporting bodies are independent from political interference, etc. And they came, and it split the nation. I mean, that's probably the reason I'm living here. But you know, the British and Irish Lions is such an amazing institution. And you don't have to be a good player. Well, you have to be a good player to be in the mix, but to actually get selected on Lions Tour, you also have to be lucky. You have to be lucky with injury. You have to be lucky with the coach. You have to be lucky with the opposition not be, you know, maybe being injured as well, and you get your chance. And I snuck on as a replacement, and it was from a rugby perspective, it was magnificent.
Yeah. Now, the team arrived. Some of the real, if I'm not mistaken, the only name from '74 that had survived was Andy Irvin. It seemed like most of the heavy hitters that had done so much damage in '74 had moved on.
Yeah.
And the team arrived here, Bill Beaumont, the captain. And the two scrum halves were your Irish
my
stablemate,
nemesis, Colin Patterson, who
Patterson.
broke my heart. He was an absolutely brilliant player. And he had a cockiness that I never really had. I maybe acted it out, but he was just a self-belief, little tiny guy, but strong as an ox and quick. And yeah, he was there. And Terry Holmes was the other one, the Welsh.
And they were quite different, wasn't it? Because Terry Holmes was a big guy for a scrum half, which was quite
in those days. In those days, he was about 6'1", 6'2", which is par for the course nowadays. But yeah, and Patterson was little, and they were two brilliant players, both far better than I was.
And you're too modest, John. But what I do recall was that you had the Irish pair and you had the Welsh pair at halfback.
Yeah.
You had Terry Holmes with
Gareth Davis, Ollie Campbell, and Colin Patterson. Yeah, that's right.
And then as the series got off to the most incredible start, didn't it? And that was when Derek Cornell absolutely threw the biggest haymaker right in the open to give Mornay du Plessis the biggest black eye I've ever seen.
Can I tell you a story about that?
Please.
Oh, it was so funny. I was sitting on the bench. I came out as a replacement for a game in Stellenbosch, and then I went straight on the bench for the first test. You know, here we were, the first test in '74, Lions against the Springboks, and the atmosphere was unbelievable. I mean, the whole rugby world was watching it, and the whole of South Africa was watching it to make amends from '74. And the game kicked off, and then suddenly, and I've never learned why, Derek Cornell hit. Mornay sort of popped up in a ruck, and Derek Cornell hit him a smack. And I thought, oh my God, there's going to be civil war. I wonder, is they going to be fighting up on the reserves bench? This is not supposed to happen. And the Springboks kept their cool. There was no retaliation. There was no panic. There was no shouting, whatever. They stuck to their guns, and they won a magnificent test match. And for 35 years, I was using that in public speeches as an example to kids, motivation, leadership, whatever. How captaincy works, how you keep your cool, you put the team first. And I made speeches around that incident. And then about, 5 years ago or something, I was introducing Mornay at an event down in Cape Town. And I told the story. And I said, now, ladies and gentlemen, the man who did it, great Springbok captain, Mornay du Plessis. And he came on, and in that South African accent of his. He said, John, that's the nicest introduction I've ever had. He says, you got one thing slightly wrong, though. He says, in those days, there was no cake veers and instant replays. And you might remember we didn't leave the field at half time. He says, quite simply, we didn't know who had hit me. And he says, you might recall in the second test, 2 weeks later, we kicked the shit out of Derek Quinnell. So in one moment, he destroyed 35 years. But it was wonderful. Wonderful memories. I remember it like yesterday.
Did you ever get to the reason why he did it?
No. No idea. Funny, Derek Quinnell is a lovely, lovely guy. I mean, he's now a granddad. Gee whiz. He was also Barry John's brother-in-law, which a lot of people didn't know. And it was never discussed after the game that I can remember. And I think it was just over-motivation. And that's all I can consider. Because Derek Quinnell was a hard player, but was not a dirty player. Well, he was in that instant, I can say.
Because South Africa, rugby at that time seemed to be getting dirtier and dirtier, right? And throughout the 70s, I mean, it had really got...
I think rugby in general was a dirty game then. I mean, we remember, again, before that tour, Wales played England and Paul Ringer got sent off. It was one of the dirtiest games ever, and England won the Grand Slam, and Paul Ringer was sent off in disgrace, and there was a lot of bad blood about, and I think that particular series, which wasn't a dirty series, I know it sort of sounds, except for that incident, and I think that was to do with the two captains, Billy Beaumont and Morné du Plessis. There was so much respect between the two of them, and I think we said let's put rugby first, and of course nowadays you can't lift a fist, or a handbag, or you'll be banned and whatever.
Because of course responding to dirty play had cost South Africa dearly in '74, where they were totally intimidated by the Lions, and nearly cost us the '76 series against the All Blacks. We had to rely on our 16th man, i.e. the referee, to win that series.
That was a dirty series.
That was a
when you get guys like Sid Going standing up and having stand-up fights. I mean, it was a shocking. But that's what rugby was in those days. If you went down, you play against France, my goodness me, you get caught in the bottom of a ruck. That's what it is, and it's unbelievable looking back on it.
Yeah.
And yet that's the way it was, and very few people got injured, amazingly.
But let's just take it back a step. That's where I first saw you. You came to South Africa as a replacement, and according to me, I know you way too hard on yourself. I thought you played your way into the team, and you played in the last test.
I did, yeah.
But that's not obviously where the story starts, right? You obviously built up to that. I mean, you were always a rugby player.
Rugby was my absolute passion in life, and I grew up in Ireland. My mum is Welsh, my father's Scottish, but they got married during the war, and my dad was in the Merchant Navy, an engineer, and he got a job as marine superintendent for Guinnesses, running the Guinness ships for the north of England and Scotland. And we lived in a place called Greystones, idyllic place, 20 miles south of Dublin. But my grandparents from Wales came over. My granddad, being Welsh, was a rugby fan. And I loved my granddad. And Cliff Morgan, the great fly half, had married an Irish girl from fly half from 55. And he came over for a season and played for Bective Rangers in Dublin. And as a result, Bective Rangers had a wonderful fixture list with Ebbw Vale, Cardiff, Neath. The Welsh teams used to come over. And my granddad, of course, took me to see those, and I just fell in love with rugby. It was my passion. I ate, slept, and drank rugby. And then luckily went to a school that was a good rugby school, but a little small Protestant school, as opposed to the big Catholic schools, which I suppose in a way would be the equivalent of a small English-speaking school against the big Afrikaans high schools. That would be the equivalent here. And my little school won the Leinster Schools Cup, which was the biggest thing in rugby, apart from the internationals. And that sort of set me off on the road to a little bit of profile. And interestingly, in a couple of weeks, we're having our 50th anniversary of that win. And all but two of the team are alive, so we're going back to Ireland to celebrate that. So, yeah, rugby was pretty much it for me, everything for me from a very early age.
And then when did you start attracting the attention of the Irish selectors?
Well, it was bizarre. So much of my rugby career is bizarre. School set me off, and I went to Trinity College Dublin, and I became the youngest ever captain of the oldest continual rugby club in the world. Trinity College Dublin is the oldest non-stop rugby club in the world. And so as the youngest captain, I followed on the worst season in their history, and we had one of the best seasons. We won the Leinster Senior Cup, and it was just marvellous, just a combination of hard work, of dedication, and of luck. And we just had this wonderful season. So I'd had these two amazing school career and then an amazing university career. And the Australian side were up. I played one interprovincial, last interprovincial of the season. There's 4 provinces in Ireland, and there's obviously an interprovincial championship. And Leinster had done very badly, and I got picked as this 19-year-old to play against Ulster. And Ulster had a great side, but they were a clean side. Munster would be slightly different, maybe. And I had a reasonable game, but got ridiculous publicity because I was this young. I looked about 15, and I just was captaining Trinity. So I got this crazy publicity. And anyway, the Irish trial came up for the game against Australia. The Australians were touring, and they picked a squad. They announced a squad that was going to train the next day. I beg your pardon. The Irish trial was picked, and I wasn't in the Irish trial. There were 4 scrum halves ahead of me, and I watched the trial. I paid in and watched it, and I thought the scrum half, Robbie McGrath, did very well. And then I went down to the pub that evening to watch Match of the Day, the soccer on the BBC. And then somebody said, no, they've announced the training squad for the next day, because obviously everybody was in Dublin for the trial, so they were having a training squad the next day, and the 4 scrum halves were announced and I wasn't in it. Fair enough. And then halfway through Match of the Day, my dad phoned down to the pub and said, the Irish coach, Robbie Meads, wants to speak to you. Will you come back here? He's going to phone in 10 minutes. So I said, what's this? And I thought maybe someone's got injured. Maybe they're going to bring me into the squad session. And I went up the road. We lived very close. And Robbie Meads said, you're in the team to play Australia. So I don't know what happened between selecting the squad with 4 scrum halves and not me. I suspect they had a long lunch or tea with plenty of pints of Guinness, because next second I was playing Australia, just 20 years of age, scared, playing club matches, and that was it. So it was absolutely bizarre, and I still don't know how they came upon that decision, but I was quite happy to accept it.
Yes. And how long was that? What year was that?
That was 1976.
Okay.
I was very, very young. And then 77, I was in the running for the Lions tour to New Zealand. Gareth Edwards didn't go. Bryn Williams we knew was going to get picked, and it was between me and Dougie Morgan, the Scottish scrum half. And even though we lost, I'd apparently outplayed him when we played Scotland, so my name was in the hat. And I trained every single day for a month, which in those days was rare, amateur rugby every day. Being a student, I could do it, and I broke my leg against France after 2 minutes. And that was me out for quite a while. And then I went to Cambridge University, and I was out of the picture slightly. And so I didn't play for Ireland between 77. And then I was on the bench for the Lions and got into the Lions team, and then got back into the Irish team. So I had a very stuttering career, mainly due to I suppose how I played, and also due to there were a lot of scrum halves around, and due to injury. But my international career, apart from that Lions tour, was not very successful.
Because you came back in 81.
I came back 81. I don't like to talk about it. It was the Irish tour. It split the country. It was a disastrous tour for me, even though Ireland played quite well in the tests. And I picked up, of all things, a virus in my shoulder, and woke up after the first game and I couldn't lift my shoulder. And so I ended up having a disastrous tour. But I got offered a job. I lost my job coming on that tour, and then got offered a job here. And my wife and I decided to come for a year, and here we are 43 years later.
Now, as anybody that's watched this before, especially my interview with Nick Mallett, will know that I'm a big Transvaal supporter, or Lions supporter. And I was very, very surprised, I remember, to see that John Robbie, the Lions scrum half, is going to be joining Transvaal as they were then.
Well, you didn't join Transvaal. I mean, I joined the Wanderers club and played in a trial, and I played my first game for Wanderers against Harlequins in Pretoria, who had a hell of a side and had a good game. I remember putting Ray Mort in for a try and dropping a goal, and we got a 23-all draw with a Pretoria club side, which was considered good, and I found myself in the Transvaal team. And, you know, instead of playing provincial games, it's all changed now in Ireland, but, you know, if we played Munster on a good day, we'd get 5,000-6,000 people, maybe a little bit more in Limerick. And here we were playing in front of 20, 30, 40,000 people in provincial games, and I came here for a year to improve my rugby.
Yeah, and of course, while you were here, that team changed dramatically, obviously helped by the entrance of one Louis Late. Then managed to... and I think they built a new highway between Joburg and Pretoria, because suddenly there were a few people that decided to further their career.
Not in the early days. Not in the early days. In fact, at one stage, because Louis Late was an extraordinary human being, extraordinary. He had a wonderful sense of humour. He could be charming beyond belief. He had a way of taking a vision, a big picture, and saying, we're going to get there. Forget anything negative, we're going to get there. And he galvanized Transvaal rugby. He was like a breath of fresh air. But then once he was in and doing it, then I think paranoia came in, jealousies came in, imaginary slights came in, and I think that was what he was like in all walks of life. But I had a good relationship with him. We sometimes, you know, exchanged words and so on, but he certainly changed things. And one year, in fact, it was even suggested that Naas Botha was going to come down and join. In other words, Louis Late was going to make him an offer. Yeah. Now, of course, this was all clandestine because it was supposedly amateur. It was semi-professional. We got money under the table. And I remember the Transvaal team said, no, we don't want to win with Naas. We want to beat Naas. Yes. Playing for Northerns, which was ironic because he kicked us out of the final in 1987, I think it was, in the rain, in one of the greatest kicking performances ever, with the old leather ball. Yeah. Rain hammering down. At one stage, it was hailstoning.
I do remember it very, very well.
And Naas kicked 4 penalties and 4 drop goals.
I mean, I think that that Transvaal team on that day outplayed them in every
15-6 at half time. And I can remember because we were on the field, we didn't leave the field in those days. And I can remember looking around as Yanni Breert, one of the great players and one of the nicest guys, was giving a team talk. And I looked around and I could see some of the players were looking up at the stands. And I thought, we're not going to win this. In my heart, that fear is now gone. And of course, it went down to the wire, but we lost. But what an experience.
Yeah, and anybody who didn't watch that should go and just look. I came across some, I suppose you could call them highlights if you're
if you're a Northern fan.
It was a very sad day because I remember sitting there thinking, we've got this one. I was also one of those people.
15-6 at half time. The late Leon Kirkham scored and Skalk Nadir scored as well.
Yeah, because certainly it was a hell of a team, and then leading into that. And, interestingly, you should mention this situation of people standing up and saying, we don't want Naas because we want to beat Naas. I'll never forget, a few years later, there was an incident where we did, in the second iteration of the successful Transvaal team of that era, under Kitch Christie.
Oh, wow, yeah.
When we did manage to win a few Currie Cups. And just ahead of the final, we had 2 of our fullbacks get injured. Right, we had, if you remember, Chris Dirks, and I think it was Gavin Johnson who was the other
Magic
Johnson, and they were both suddenly injured, and we were having a problem at fullback. And the next thing, it's announced that Gerbrand Grobler was coming to Transvaal. Now, I think after Naas Botha, the late Gerbrand Grobler, who was quite a feisty character,
you can say that again,
was certainly not the fan favourite at Ellis Park. And reading the newspaper, and suddenly Gerbrand Grobler was coming to the Transvaal, and I think myself, it was like an April Fool's joke. But other than Naas Botha, he's the one guy we don't want to see in the jersey. And what they also added in the newspaper was that people were phoning Ellis Park to complain. So I thought, well, as a devout supporter, best I get on the phone. And I phoned Transvaal Rugby Union as they were that day, and I said, I've got a season ticket holder, and I'm phoning to complain about Cameron Grobler joining the Transvaal team. So by now, I think I wasn't first in the queue, and the woman on the switchboard said, well, I've been told to give you this number, and you must phone and speak to the coach. So I wrote this number down and phoned, and it was a landline before cell phones were ubiquitous, and who answers the phone? None other than Kitch Christie.
Oof.
Right? I'm thinking to myself, this is like I've been set up, because phone this number and speak to the coach. I thought I could joke. I thought it was going to end up... and I ended up having a hell of a conversation with Kitch Christie, and he explained in detail what was behind his decision.
Yeah.
And he said, it sounds like you really know your rugby and you're a passionate supporter. And he says, you're very angry today, he said to me. He said, but on Saturday we're going to play a final, he said. And you will be a lot more angry if we lose that final. And if we've got Cameron Grobler in the side playing fullback, we'll win that final, which the team did. They absolutely routed, I think, a bad Free State team.
That's right.
And I don't think Cameron Grobler, Sham, I think he died. He got killed in that car accident in the off season.
Very sad. Lovely guy, and a very good cricketer as well. You know, had he stuck to one sport, maybe could have played for South Africa. But hell, a lot of people we're talking about have died. Isn't it terrible? Terrible getting old, Mike.
It is. But then, John, to go back to your career, you then ride the wave of this very successful Transvaal outfit, and there's no doubt that at that point you're one of the best scrum halves in the country, if not the best at the time. And then, of course, South Africa is quite isolated, but you did manage to don the Springbok jersey.
Another story about that one, which I only heard very recently. Yeah, the England team came out. What happened was we were coming for a year, and I was in the Transvaal team. Then I got... In fact, I wasn't even injured. I was sick. I had to have an operation, minor operation, but I was out of the team. And then I thought, if you go back now and people will say, but you're not actually in the team, are you? It'll come back and it'll look like a failure. You didn't make it. So Jenny and I were enjoying ourselves. Our son was very small. And we said, well, let's give it another year. And the next year I had a fantastic season. Everything went well and the team played well. And someone said to Doc Craven, of course, who ruled South African rugby, with a rod of iron, can this Robbie character play for South Africa? And Donnie Craven said, well, has he got a permanent residence? It's an amateur game. If somebody moves for their career, they can't be penalised from play. Of course he can play. And so I suddenly thought to myself, little old John Robbie, not a great player, obviously a good player. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was a very good player, but never one of the greats. And I thought, but Ireland, Lions and Springboks, now that would be pretty impressive. So England came out and I was on the bench for the 2 games against England. Magnificent series. I mean, Donny Gerber scored that hat-trick in the second one. But just before this recent Lions tour, my former colleague Jenny Cruis-Williams wrote a book about Springbok versus Lions series, where she got various people, journalists, to go back and just document the series, going way back to the 19th century. And then in between, she got various people to comment, one of whom was myself as a Lion. And one of them was Hannes Marais, the former Lions captain and selector. And Hannes Marais said, I'll come on the program, but when you hand over to John Robbie, I want to tell him something. What? I want to tell him something he doesn't know. Now I'm very worried. I thought, oh my God, what's coming here? So this was all set up, and Hannes talks about captain against the 74 Lions and how difficult it was and blah, 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 blah. And then they hand over to me, and Hannes says, John Robbie, I want to tell you something. And I said, yes, Hannes. And he said, you were selected to play against England in 1984. And I said, no, Hannes, I was on the bench. He says, no, you were selected. You were selected in the team. The team was there, put down. Cecil Moss was the coach, whatever. You were at scrum half, and Divin Serfontein was on the bench. And then one of the selectors, who said was a fairly conservative chap, I have my ideas who it was, said, guys, if we're playing England, right, we're playing the English of all people, and we're going to put an Englishman, in at scrum half. Can you imagine the disgrace and row? And he persuaded them to put me on the bench. So not alone did I get a jersey as reserve, and then I did play on that horrible internal tour. But he told me I was actually selected to play for South Africa, which of course means nothing now, but it's kind of interesting to know.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a proper series, even though
Yeah.
Dani Gerber was playing, he was in a different league at that point of
South Africa were in a different league at that time. I mean, Karel Duplessis and pack of four was Rob Lowe. Oh, they were, and Divan Serfontein was, what a lovely guy. I mean, we used to play against each other, and we used to chat during the game. I'd say, a good kick, Divan, nice break. And he'd say, oh, that was a good pass there, John, off the left hand. And always a handshake at the first scrum, Lovely, lovely guy.
Yeah, and then John, you moved. Well, firstly, you said you had a job. What did you come out and do?
It's a very funny story. When I was on that for me a dreadful Irish tour, a very controversial tour, I got this weird thing in my shoulder. It was neuralgia amyotrophica. It was called. It was like a nerve virus that affected the deltoid muscle, and I lost the power of my arm. And so I was staying in the Rosebank Hotel, and I was being treated by Dr. Clive Noble. And Robbie Egnos, who is a very well-known physio, was looking after me. And so I was being treated there. The team had moved off, I think, to Potchefstroom to play a game there. And on the treatment on Saturday, Robbie Egnos said, what are you doing tomorrow? And I said, oh, I'm in the hotel. And he said, in those days, Joburg closes on a Sunday. There's nothing on. He said, would you like to come to a braai? And I said, yeah, that'll be very nice. So we went to a braai, a guy called Coke Bavel, Paul Bavel's elder brother. Right. And Coke had played one game for Transvaal. He was a stalwart of Wits and Wanderers. Lovely guy. And
these guys really stick together.
They stick, of course they do. And we had rather a lot to drink. Shall I put it that way? We had rather a lot to drink. Marvellous evening, and taxied home, I might add. And I woke up in the morning and I thought, God, I've got this weird dream. I've had this weird dream that I've accepted a job to come work in South Africa. And then as I woke up, I realized it wasn't a dream, that I'd been offered a job with National Trading Company. It was a sort of engineering trading company. And so I had to phone my wife in Ireland and say, would you ever think of coming here? And she said, the weather was shocking in Ireland. She said, how's the weather? And I said, it's magnificent. She said, I'm in. So that's how it happened. And I worked for National Trading for 7 years. Yes. On the sales side mainly. And it was wonderful. And in a funny way, and I say this to all kids, if I'm asked to speak to kids about life in general, career, whatever, at some stage, try selling something. At some stage, you've got to sell something. Because when you've stood as a trembling sales rep outside the door of a chief engineer of some huge factory, and you've got to go in and present and so on, and you're terrified, and then you learn that lesson that in your little area of engineering, which for me was centrifugal pumps of all things, probably more than he does. He knows about everything, but that tiny area, and when you've learned to do that and to be able to present and speak to people in authority, little did I realize how it was giving me a grounding for my future career in radio, where you were talking to politicians or famous people or bigwigs, and you learned to be able to talk to them as human beings. So, it's 7 very happy years with National Trading Company.
And then I do recall, as your career was winding down, if I'm not mistaken, you might still have been playing.
I was, yeah.
And once again, if my memory serves you, the first time I heard you, I think might have been a Currie Cup final. Or close to it.
No, what happened was I'd got injured when the Cavaliers were here. Do you remember the the Rebel New Zealand side? 86. And I got injured. Of all things, one of my own players, Dan Badenhorst, tackled me and smashed me in a training session because George Rotenbach had come up from the Eastern Cape. So Dan was playing for his place, and I got smashed, and I did something to my collarbone, and acromioclavicular, something like that. And so I missed out on the Cavaliers tour. And then Alan Wilkins, who was commentating for the SABC, they had the rugby in those days, he decided on this radical step to bring in a sidekick who was a current player. And he asked me, would I like to commentate? So I commentated on the Cavalier series, and it became a bit of a novelty. And, I'm told some people even turned the television commentary down and put the radio on. But it was unusual in those days, and I loved it. Talking about rugby. And then 702, who suddenly were in opposition. They had opposition with Radio 5, who had the great SABC signal. We had a terrible signal, or 702 had a terrible signal. And John Burks had heard in America that they often brought in sports personalities to do the sports reports as a sort of a gimmick, And someone said, well, who could do it here? And he said, what about this Robbie guy? I heard him during the commentary. So Chris Gibbons, legendary newsman, invited me for a lunch, and we had a deal, and I started doing the early morning sport on 702 for the princely sum of 28 rand a shift, which was 4 o'clock till 6 in the morning with, maybe an hour and a half's preparation. And I fell in love with radio, and a year later was offered full time, and that's where it started.
And that was now the end of your career, and you became...
I was lucky to fall in, because I wasn't... my job was a rugby job at National Trading, and it was very helpful to me in hindsight. But I wasn't passionate about selling centrifugal pumps, if I can put it that way. My passion was rugby. That's what I dreamt about. And then I was lucky enough to fall into another career that I was passionate about, which was radio. And then, of course, as I got politically aware, and as the new South Africa dawned, this golden opportunity to avoid a racial, bloody civil war came. And then I moved into talk radio and was lucky enough to be there during the most amazing time in the country's history.
And you rode that wave for many, many years. You were a part of the furniture, therefore.
I was on radio. I was on 702 for 30 years, and I was on the morning show for 17. But I started off in the graveyard shift, 10 to midnight, doing this sort of no-holds-barred talk radio show. And the first week was unbelievable. We had discussions, and people phoned in talking about things and mentioning things that were not allowed to be mentioned on the radio. And then a week later, on the 2nd of February 1990, FW stood up and announced, that the world is changing. Mandela's out, the ANC, the Communist Party, what a. And there was this funny little radio show, 10 o'clock, where people could hear different views. And so it was an absolute lucky break at the time. And in a funny way, in a normal, when I say a normal country, because South Africa was anything but normal in those days, a guy from the outside, from a different country, to come in and start pontificating and driving debate and holding to people to account, that would hardly succeed. You couldn't do it. But for that reason, it worked for me in South Africa, because apartheid put people into different pigeonholes. And if you happen to be white and a rugby player, 99% this was how you thought. If you happened to be black from Soweto, this was how you thought. If you were coloured or people were put into pigeon boxes. And here was this white rugby player, loud-mouthed Irishman, with opinions and this, that, and the other, a little bit rude, perhaps. And as a result, nobody could put me into this pigeon box. People tried to put me into a different pigeonhole. And as a result, I managed to forge an opening in a career there that I think would not... That's why, when I look at what Trevor Noah did in America, was unbelievable. This kid from Soweto who went there and took on a national talk show and made it. And he didn't have that advantage of that little window of opportunity I did that I've just described. Yeah. So even though I've never met Trevor Noah, he's my absolute hero in broadcasting.
Well, interestingly, you talk about your career, and it actually reminds me that something that you don't know is that together you and I actually have saved lives, and you wouldn't even know about this. Here's another one of those sort of revelations.
I'm now trembling. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I'll never forget. You were once you used to host a sports roundup program on 702 on Saturday afternoons.
That's right,
evenings,
sports
right?
talk. Yeah, yeah.
And the Mike Gatting English team, the Rebel cricket team.
Wow, yeah.
Which was the last of the Rebel teams that came out to South Africa. They came out, and there was a test match at the Wanderers. And being a sports fan, off I went, and came home and was listening to you on the radio, and I decided to phone in.
Oh no, yes.
I did, and you were saying, well, you'd heard about these things, and there were protests outside, and there were protests inside, and it was this, it was that. And I phoned in, and I said, there I was, also a man with opinions, and I said, well, as most sort of white South Africans, I had supported all the rebel sports because, it felt to me with all the publicity that you had that South Africa was being victimized and this, that, and the other, and I was sports mad and I couldn't watch sport, and the rebel tours had given us a lifeline. I said, but this just feels wrong, right? Because South Africa was starting to change. I mean, let's not forget, everybody makes out, and obviously history loves sound bites, and it seems like the F.W. de Klerk announcement came out of the blue. No, we knew it was coming.
Yeah.
We knew it was coming from the talks in 87.
We knew PW was going to in 85, and he bottled. Yes, and so there was change in the air, but he actually made that step. And I was never a fan of FW, but let's give him credit.
Let's give him credit. But once he took over from PW, it became a matter of when rather than if.
Yeah, okay.
So now we were definitely in that when period when the Gatting tour came out. And I phoned in and I said, John, I was at the cricket. I've supported these matches before, but this is just not right.
Yeah.
Right? Something is dreadfully wrong. We've got to call off the tour because that was the big question at the time. In fact, the tour got called off straight after that match. There was that sort of moment where they said, okay, we'll let the match finish and then we'll call off the rest of the tour. And you were kind enough to say, and he's our caller of the day, and he wins the prize.
Oh, my word. And I don't even remember prizes,
There was a prize. I can tell you this because the prize was a scuba diving lesson.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know, the scuba diving. Yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, what? I couldn't give a damn. I don't want to scuba dive ever.
Yeah.
So I got this prize and... Yeah, I've won this prize. And I'm thinking, I was with some friends and I'm thinking, the last thing I'd ever want to do is scuba dive, okay? I'm quite happy on the boat. And a friend of mine came to me and said, my nephew would love to do a scuba diving thing, blah, 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 youngster. And he did it. I gave it to him. I gave him my prize. And he ended up becoming a sort of a top paramedic.
Wow.
With this whole scuba diving thing was the launching pad. So you and I, we've saved some lives.
Really?
You would have never thought.
That's fantastic.
But those were interesting times. And then, of course, you became a broadcaster, but you also did a lot of television work, and you're still a rugby man. So just as we sort of near the end here, John, what do you think of modern rugby compared? We spoke about the earlier days when you were involved, where it was... a very different sport, the intimidation was part of the game.
Stoppages were part of the game as well.
The game only played for about 25 minutes.
If you're lucky, 21, 22 minutes, sorry, you're asking me what I think, obviously.
What do you think of the modern game?
I love it, but I think that its evolution has been a little bit slow. And I think the product that is on sale, or has been on sale, and the classic example was the last World Cup. We all celebrate the wonderful win in the final, but we forget that everybody was booing Faf de Klerk and the Springboks for booting it up in the air the whole time. They had this very, very low risk policy, and they ended up beating Wales, who had the same policy, and it was one of the most shocking games ever, if you were non-South African or non-Welsh. And you also have this issue that rugby now being a major world sport rather than a minor world sport, which it was for many years, has this issue of safety. And what rugby is terrified of is in front of 500 million people on television. England, Wales at Twickenham. Was it Twickenham or Cardiff? I can't remember. The other day, someone's going to die. Someone's going to break their neck and die on the field. And what would that do? The fastest declining sport in New Zealand at the moment is rugby. Did you know that? The biggest sport in New Zealand is netball. The second biggest is soccer. Because obviously the elite athletes play rugby and everyone wants to play rugby. But the ones underneath are dropping it because it's so physical. So rugby, I think, is right to look at the safety aspects of it. And a lot of the things that annoy us and frustrate us with the referees are because of safety. Whether a tackle is an inch above the shoulder or below the shoulder, red card, yellow card, whatever. But what I love is, and the other thing, of course, is that when we played, the front five, with the exception of maybe a hooker, never tackled. They trundled from ruck to ruck, line out to line out, and occasionally did something in the loose, and that was the way it was. Now you've got 15 fit athletes who can all tackle and take tackles on the same size pitch. So obviously with 5 extra tacklers, defensive lines are so much tighter. And this has been one of the problems, that the game was so tight, these thin lines facing each other. They bash away, and then boot the ball up in the air and chase it, with the exception of the occasional brilliant piece of play. As a product, that's not good enough. The dyed-in-the-wool rugby player might appreciate it, but the person who could be watching, professional wrestling or, I don't know, Big Brother on television that rugby's got to attract to pay the salaries, that's not good enough. And this business of speeding it up, with the clock on the kicker and also the pressure to get into lineouts and so on. Looking at the Six Nations so far, it has been unbelievable how quickly the games have opened up. Because what happens is in rugby, you get this grind, and suddenly the petrol runs out. And then you get that spell around 65 minutes, 60 minutes, 65, when the game opens up, you get spectacular play. Now, what I've noticed is that, and I hope I'm right, that because of the less time to recover at set pieces and goal kicks, now what's happening is that moment of opening up is happening much earlier. It's happening much earlier. We're seeing amazing broken play running earlier on in test matches, and it's fabulous. And it means then that the substitutes perhaps will come on earlier, and then maybe you'll even see a second breaking open of play. So I think we're on the right track to getting a game that is wonderful to watch again. And the level of skill and the level of athleticism is absolutely terrifying, but it's also wonderful. I look at the modern players today and I'm just in awe. The offloading, the passing, the skills, the kicking, everything. And even, as scrum half, my great skill was passing the ball. I was a very good passer of the ball. And now I can see prop forwards coming in and they ping the ball off both sides. But I bet they couldn't do it with a wet leather ball at Ellis Park.
Yeah, well, because Pete Creer didn't do it often, did he?
Yeah, I know, you're right.
And then, John, just second, as we sort of look at it, South African provincial teams now playing in Europe. Do you think that's been a good move?
Yeah, it's been interesting. It's been good. I was initially against it because now you get people playing against each other so often. I can remember as a young boy when again, very controversial, when the Springboks ran out at Lansdowne Road in 1970. And because of the demonstrations, one end was empty and I wasn't allowed to go to the game. My parents were quite worried about it. And I think also were objecting to it. But to see the Springbok jerseys and to see the players running out, they were like people from a different planet. And that was part of the fun of a touring side. Now when you've got the South African sides playing against the European sides, and then we're going to do it all again at the World Cup, except they're going to be national sides, I thought this is wrong. It somehow just doesn't feel right. And yet it's been terrific. It's been most enjoyable. But I hope, against all hope, they never put the Springboks into the Six Nations or Seven Nations, as it would be, because that would make a mockery of the tradition of the whole thing. And I also think that Australia and New Zealand will regret perhaps not fighting hard enough to keep South Africa down here, the South African teams down here.
Yeah, because it was sad with the Tri-Nations, or the Rugby Championship as we call it now, includes Argentina. It's really sad that it's ended Test series, which I thought were wonderful. South Africa, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, etc.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've still got that side of things. You've got the Test matches down south are great, but I'm talking more about the provincial games. They change the names so often, Super, whatever it was. I thought that tournament was marvellous. And may I just say, we all hope South Africa wins the World Cup next year. And I love to see Ireland doing well. I mean, it's unbelievable, but watch out for New Zealand. Watch out for New Zealand. That's where my money is.
Well, that was going to be the last question. You've dealt with that then, John.
Under the radar. When did you ever see New Zealand coming into a World Cup under the radar? And some of the performances over the weekend were magnificent. But having said that, there are 2 World Cups. There are the qualifying rounds, the what do they call it? The group stage. And we've got Scotland and Ireland, which is very, very tough. And in the group stage, you can afford to take risks and make mistakes. Then you have 3 finals. And we are great at 3 finals, But if we can get through that stage, I think that might even be harder than getting to the final. But it's going to be a wonderful World Cup, and the French will put on a great show. It's always wonderful, and I can't wait for it.
Well, there you go. To everybody that's joined us today, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. John, Robbie, thank you so much.
Thanks very much indeed, Mike. Pleasure.
To everybody that's joined us, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, and we'll see you again on Sport of the Nation. Thank you so much.